David Fogel, CEO of the Symphonina Foundation, and I'm joined today by Alexander Unseth. Alex is the winner of our 2023 Best Symphonina of the Year competition from last year. By the way, this year's competition is open now as we record this podcast. The deadline for entries is December 10th, and there's more information about that at www.symphonina.org. But Alex submitted the prize winner for last year and received the $2,000 first prize, and he also had his music recorded live and appearing on our album Advent of the Symphonina, which made it to #1 on Billboard and the traditional classical albums chart lists in August, and is also still up for one award, Best Classical Album of the Year at the World Entertainment Awards, which will be adjudicated next year. And we're just delighted to have this time with Alex. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing fantastic, David. Thanks as always for letting me talk a little bit about my music.
Yeah, well, let's start with where you got started with your music. It's a good place to start with most people, and I think you have a kind of unique story. So let's hear your story.
Sure. So I come from a very musical family for a couple of generations. My parents started me on cello at the age of 5, which is a pretty normal age, even though it sounds very young. It's pretty normal to start a string instrument younger. So I started cello at 5. And then I started piano at the age of 12. And it was a very clear foundation for me in terms of music, because since I was in such a musical family, I was able to play like a duet or a trio with my siblings. So I was getting the opportunity from a very young age to collaborate musically. And it really showed me both the soloistic side of music and then later the more collaborative side of music. And I feel like that really set me up to eventually start composing.
It's great. So when you started on cello at 5, I was having this conversation with Laura Chan earlier, about 3 weeks ago. She's a violin player. And at the conservatory where she started, they would start kids even on a double bass. At a very young, I had to ask, how does that work? And she explained to me that there is like a quarter-size double bass. So when you start cello at 5, is it too big for you, or do they give you a half-size cello, or how does it work?
Yeah, so it's the same with violin. There's a quarter size, half size, three-quarter size, and full size. So they obviously create them so that a 5-year-old child can play them. They obviously are not, I mean, the sound of a quarter size compared to the sound of a full size is obviously drastically different, but when you're 5, you don't totally care about how you sound. You're just trying to learn the instrument.
Right. Your bow costs $25. So what can you do anyway, right? and your quarter size cello is really a viola that's been turned upside down for you. So right. Okay. So, but I do have another question. So by 7 years of playing cello, I'm guessing you're really very, very good at cello. And how did you find the shift from going from cello to piano?
Yeah, so it was a very big shift. I will say, so cello reads in bass clef. So when I started piano, I obviously had 7 years, as you say, of cello. So I was able to read the bass clef quite quickly. And in cello, you learn 2 other clefs, tenor clef and treble clef. So by the time I started piano, I actually was knowledgeable in both treble and bass clef. So I was able to read the notation. So for me, the hard part was obviously learning to just play the piano, have that technique. But playing cello to start gave me a very solid foundation in approaching the piano. It was just a much different set of techniques than cello was.
Yeah, I wonder if it's easier to go from one direction to the other, because I often hear, particularly from woodwind players, that woodwind players who start on the piano have an easier time on the woodwinds. And maybe that's like true in general. Starting on the piano, you kind of get a wide range of notes. You can play from the low end to the high end as I'm looking at my keyboard in front of me. And you have to read bass and treble clef and maybe get that sort of hand-eye coordination for playing that you need for other things too. But your experience might have varied. So if you had to do it over again, would you have started on the piano first and gone to the cello, or were you like happy the way you did it?
That's a very interesting question, because if you think of the piano, your two hands are in front of you and they're playing. I mean, like, it's not like your right hand is doing something drastically different than your left. They're both right in front of you playing keys. With cello, only one hand is really playing notes and the other one is moving the bow. So they're both very different in terms of like how they operate. But I would say starting on cello gave me a much more in-depth view of how to be emotional about my music. Because with cello, there's really so much you can do in terms of the sound that you can't necessarily do on a piano. So I think having that broader view of, for example, extended techniques, but also uh, like legato and staccato, and how your bow hand is dictating a lot of the sound that you play. So I think I would not have changed anything, because I think having that cello foundation set me up a lot for the emotional capabilities of a piano. Not to say that it's harder to do it on the piano, but it's just very different, because you can't control like how hard you're like pressing on a string, for example, to change your sound. It's purely based on how much weight you put on your fingers, for example.
Yeah, so when you're starting cello, I rely on my own experiences. I have mentioned elsewhere with 4 months of violin training. Um, the intonation is an issue, right? And I imagine intonation is an issue at a 5-year-old trying to learn cello. It's mostly probably an issue for the 5-year-old's parents, but I think my intuition is that you would quickly move into playing in an ensemble in order to have those intonation issues maybe average out a little bit. So you probably got started in a junior orchestra, I'm guessing, as a young child, and went from there. Is that a good guess on my part?
Yes. So I learned from the Suzuki method, which is a method that really emphasizes the ability to learn works through a lot of repetition. So it gets so drilled into your head that hypothetically, I am still able to play just by form of muscle memory a lot of the pieces I learned as a kid, because you play them so often. And so, to your point, when I started as a kid, I was doing two things. So there was one which was called a group class at the school I took from. And this is where every Saturday, all these kids who were taking the Suzuki method would come together and they would just play their instruments. And you'd have some recitals, you'd have some individual stuff, but it was, again, part of the repetition. You were playing so much that you were, even if you didn't realize it, you were getting better because you were just playing it so much. The second part is the school I learned at had 4 different orchestras, each increasing difficulty. So I started at the lowest one, which was called the string ensemble at the Community Music School of Webster University. And I was on the younger side of this, and they obviously understand, to your point, that these kids are not great with intonation. So they give them arranged works and they're easy. And so, but the best thing that that's actually doing is they're helping these kids learn how to play with a conductor. Because for most of the time, you're just in a private lesson with a teacher, and that teacher may be correcting you, but it's only you. So if you sound bad, it's like, I mean, how embarrassing is it really? But now you're in an ensemble with, 50 other kids who might sound better than you, might sound worse than you. And how do you fit into that? So I'm a huge advocate for starting in those ensembles. It's a very daunting task, but if you're young enough, you almost don't remember the experience. So it's kind of best you just block it out, but you have the technique anyway.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So once you start playing one other thing before we move on in your life. So when you're playing cello early on, I'm guessing that there are nursery rhymes and things like that that you might start on that are relatively simple. but you're probably not going into like pop or rock or anything in those genres. Don't know too many hip hop cello artists. So you get introduced, I'm guessing, to the classical repertoire as you're developing to get to piano. And that maybe is one of the differences too, because piano, you pretty much play almost anything, any genre. And so kids do, and that's fine, of course. But I'm guessing you had more of a classical introduction in those 7 years of cello before you ever went to the piano. Is that pretty true?
Yes. So with the Suzuki method, they have entire books of pieces that you go down. So it goes from 1 to 10, essentially. And so, yeah, there's a lot of old folk songs, nursery rhymes. I mean, like the very first piece that you learn on a string instrument in the Suzuki method is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and then some variations with it, which, by the way, took me a year to get through. So if that doesn't tell you enough about how I struggled as a young cellist, I don't know what does. But one of the great things, just as a side note about these group classes that we did, is because they were sort of unstructured, we did things like from the Beatles. Like I know we did a cello rendition of Eleanor Rigby at a concert once. Very interesting, very new, but it really does help to, like, it makes you realize that there's a lot of string and classical type music in pop songs. And it's a very eye-opening thing for a kid because you're like, oh, like I've always loved that song by the Beatles, and now I can play it on the cello.
Yeah. And that's something I think is indeed missed, that orchestral music does extend across many, many genres and can be used with great benefit in those genres. Okay, so we get to the piano. So now, what's your experience like with the piano, and did you ever perform any piano recitals, concerts, things like that as part of an orchestra, like in a piano concerto format, or how did it go on the piano for you?
Sure. So started piano at the age of 12. So my father started teaching me in sort of the beginner books for piano, and then I got a private teacher, and I really only took for that private teacher for about 2 years. And I think I just wanted to devote more of my life to cello. I liked piano as sort of a side like instrument, and I wanted to devote more of my time to cello because by the time I was doing like really getting into piano, I was about 14. So I'd already been playing cello for 9 years. I was getting into more advanced orchestras that required a lot of time. So piano became more of a side thing. I was still keeping up with piano, and especially when I started high school, 14, 15, one of the big things that was of interest to me were all the musicals that they did. And they, of course, required pit musicians. And I was asked to play piano for Chicago one year. And by this point, I didn't have a private teacher anymore. So it was an exercise in really like teaching myself new music. And it obviously was a success, but it definitely taught me that I had the ability to teach myself these piano works without a teacher. Now, to the point of your piano concerti, I never got to that level. I don't think my technique is good enough simply because I didn't have a private teacher for that long, but I did put on some recitals, and I describe my journey with cello or with piano as more of I just do it on the side type of thing. So I can go to like a nursing home and I can play piano there and they love it because it's good enough. But to the level of piano concerti, I am far from there.
What I should ask, because we've spent a lot of time together, which we'll get to in a minute here, about mixing and getting your Symphonina No. 1 ready for production. But I've never asked you, do you play anything else besides cello and piano?
I took a couple of months of string bass, and it's a big jump from cello because your hand has a much wider range on the bass that makes your hand feel uncomfortable, which is why it's always great to start an instrument young because you're so flexible. But I took a couple lessons of that, but that is the extent of my instrumental.
Now we have to we have to jump in on that one, Alex, because there are various definitions of young. And listeners to this podcast will know that the Symphonina Foundation has a mission of spreading the joy of symphonic music to young audiences around the world. By young there, I mean anyone younger than me, which is just about everybody. So young for you, I mean, Alex, let's say, how old are you now?
I'm 22.
Okay, so that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, so Alex probably has not lost much of his flexibility in his left hand just yet. Well, give him another 40 years and we'll see how he's doing. So no brass, no woodwinds for you though.
No, I was not. So in my family, I'm from a family of 7 kids.
Wow.
Each kid played a string and piano because my mother plays violin and my father plays piano. So it was sort of inevitable, but there's no woodwinds or brass in my
Nobody
family.
broke the mold. Nobody wanted to go get a trumpet and say, I'm going to be louder than all of you.
Well, my youngest brother wanted to play trombone and drums. And we were just like, oh, so you want to be like the loudest kid in the family.
Absolutely, right.
He eventually got his drum wish, which, just as a side note, one of the great things I did as a kid is I went to a rock band camp. So it was this 1 or 2 week long intensive. And by the end of it, you were playing, like, we played a Mr. Brightside as one of our songs, and I was playing keyboard for it. So something very different, but all of these ensemble experiences really shaped the way that I think about music, because I feel like if you're always playing as a soloist, it may be personally fulfilling, but there's really just so much more to music when you collaborate with other people, even if you don't sound that great. I mean, we didn't sound that good, let's be honest, but it was fun.
I bet everybody listening enjoyed it too. So,
yes.
Which number in the sibling rivalry are you, Alex?
I'm the third oldest. I'm the first man. So
okay.
Much pressure to carry on the family.
All right, very good. Well, okay, so then while you're playing, you start to get the urge to compose things, and not everybody does. So let's talk about that. How did you decide that's what I want to do, or did it just come naturally?
Sure. So I really hadn't thought about composition. I had maybe tinkered around on the piano to a degree, but it was my father who approached me one day and said, I've heard of this thing called MuseScore, and I was wondering if you wanted to try it out. And this was in the very, very early versions of MuseScore, which, by the way, is a music notation software. So you put in individual notes on your computer. And so back in the early days when it was a very coarse sort of software, not great sound fonts, but you could put in notes. And so I began to tinker with that. It was very much experimental. I really didn't have any structure. I'd say when this started, I was 13 or 14. Really had no idea what I was doing, but I was putting down notes. Sometimes I go back to my old pieces and I stumbled upon the very first work that I wrote. It was for solo piano. It was a march in 3/4, which I'm not quite sure what the reasoning was behind that.
You just have to be different, Alex. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, like, I thought it was amazing. I'm like,
well, you didn't pick 9/8, so it's okay. Right.
But those are the kind of things I was writing. I mean, they were so like silly, and I would write pieces for my siblings that just had a bunch of weird instruments and sounded crazy. But at the time, I didn't really think anything of it, but I feel like every piece I was writing was really helping me to learn more and more about the compositional process, because I have never had a teacher. So I was essentially my own teacher. And I genuinely think just putting down these ideas, no matter how stupid they were actually contributing to a larger process of learning how to write. Because if you know what sounds bad, you can start to learn what sounds good.
Yeah, so a recurring theme here, although you did have individual lessons for your instrument, is a little bit of your own ambition, a lot of your own ambition to teach yourself things, to be self-taught. So did you take any formal composition classes along the way, or was everything learned by osmosis or by YouTube videos, or how did it go?
Yeah, so I would say, so when I started, to your first question, I have not actually had any the only formal type of composition training is I took a music theory course as a senior in high school. So I was like 18 by this time. So I had actually been composing for 4 or 5 years, tinkering more. But I, in the beginning, I knew that my sound was not good and I wasn't progressing to the speed that I wanted to. So I remember for Christmas one year, I asked for a book, Music Composition for Dummies. So it essentially was just like a deep dive into composition. And I could not understand how any of it worked because my thought was you have all of these rules and all of this, but it's not actually telling you how to write a piece. Like I want a book that says, if you want to write a piece, step one, put in this note. Step two, put in this note.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted. But I mean, obviously, in retrospect, that makes no sense because that's not actually your piece. But so those books and the YouTube videos did not resonate with me because I could not apply those concepts. I just wanted to know how to write music just by myself. So I kept composing. The big thing that I did is I eventually started writing for competitions. And this was sort of along the lines of what I wanted because they give you criteria sometimes, instrumentation, length, whatever. So they were giving me a foundation that I could then build off of. And those were very instrumental, no pun intended, in helping
Yes.
me learn more about how to hone in on my own voice in music.
So you must have had some extremely good feedback from the judges then. And I will say, as part of the Symphonina contest, we do encourage our judges. We had 21 judges, I think it was last year, to give detailed feedback to the entrants to the amount that the judges feel is appropriate. And many of them do. Not all of them do, but many of them do. So you must have had extremely good feedback to guide you about what to do and what not to do. What are some of the salient points that you picked up on that might be helpful for other very young composers who were in the same spot that you were in?
Sure. I would say the big thing, if you're submitting to a competition, it's important to know that obviously the judges are going to have their own idea of what a winning entry is. And so this is where conforming to what the criteria is, for example, for the Symphonina competition, very clear criteria in terms of what they want. All of those judges gave extremely detailed feedback. And what's really astonishing to me is when a judge can talk about your piece on a more abstract metaphysical level. Like they can actually be talking about like, oh, I hear this inspiration in your music and this inspiration in your music, which many of the judges for my first Symphonina wrote. And it's incredible to me because to be such a good musician that you can actually be like, oh, I can hear like the Broadway influences in your work. When this is something that I was only really thinking about, maybe I was putting in Easter eggs, but it wasn't like an overarching goal. Those kinds of feedback are really helpful because you understand that your music is not just resonating on a musical level, but really on a personal level. And so having that kind of feedback, which is not always given in competitions, I'd say for the majority of competitions, I actually received no feedback. And I was sort of just forced to take a step back and wonder, why did I lose? And I think the great way to also do it is to listen to who won. What do you think made that piece good enough to win? And you'll start to see patterns in those winning entries, whether they're based on criteria or just the way that they sound.
Yeah, so understanding the competition you're entering is always a good thing if you want to win it,
Yes.
right? Yeah, for
Yes.
sure. For sure. All right, so in terms of the album, we've got our number one on Billboard, like I mentioned. When you submitted the work and found out that you were the grand prize winner, we had to make a decision for recording your music live. And by the way, everybody, I want to say that the first prize for the Symphonina competition gets $2,000. Runner-up gets $1,000. That's part of the prize. We endeavor to have everybody who win and are runner-up recorded live and put on our album each year. That's not a guarantee because somebody might win and have a completely unplayable piece of music. And so we have to reserve judgment on that. But Alex's work was very intricate, technically challenging work. And so we decided collectively to go with the International Symphonina Orchestra. which is a collection of players that I put together from around the world, literally all over the world, from Ghana, Africa to Vietnam to here in the United States this last year. And for next year, it'll be different. But it's comprised of about half young aspiring professional players and about half very well-established elite players from around the world. They each record their parts separately and then return them to me, and I do the mixing, and I mix with the artist. So in this case, Alex, I'd like to ask you what was your experience like working? I mean, yeah, it doesn't have to be about me, but working together with the mixing engineer to get the sound of all the players who played your parts individually to sound the way you want.
Yeah, so I've said this before, but I will say that our sessions where we sat down, sometimes went note by note to make sure that they were
many times we went note by note.
Yes,
right.
Well, and so as a side note, I have perfect pitch. So this is part of the reason why we were sometimes going note by note. Is to me, it's sometimes a very glaring error when for someone who might not have it, they may not hear the difference. So this was part of the reason that there was a lot of note by note action, because I was like, oh, that's a little flat, or oh, that's a little sharp. But those sessions were some of the most rewarding experiences I've had in music, for the very simple reason of, when you're a composer, you're surrounded by your own music and your own sound, and you surround yourself in it, not by any choice of your own, but just because you're composing music. So of course you're going to be listening to what you're writing. And the mixing sessions, it taught me a lot, because I was hearing stuff in my own work that I really did not expect, because like there would be times, David, where you'd be like, well, let's try this. Let's try, like making this louder and making this softer. Mm-hmm. And there were some times where it like completely opened my eyes. I mean, I will say the finished product of my Symphonina is not what I heard in my head, but it's better than what I heard in my head. So I think that is the power that you have as someone who is that good at mixing, that you are able to bring out a new sound. I mean, the sound is already there. You're just helping it come out. And that was the most rewarding experience I've had in music.
Well, I appreciate that, Alex. I have to say, I don't know more than maybe two handfuls of people who work in mixing in this world, really. A bit isolated in that myself, but I don't know how many mixing engineers get the privilege of working with the composer live on Zoom with a listen to link and going through the things, rather than just taking it themselves and turning it back around. And maybe they get to get a little bit of feedback back and forth with the composer or the producer, whatever, somebody who else is responsible. So, but I'm sure many do. And it wouldn't even surprise me if most do. But I think the level of back and forth that we had and working together was quite rewarding, really, for me as well. And appreciate every aspect of working with you during that time. I think too is it's always nice as a composer when you write something that's is hard, and then you get it back from the musicians and you go, dang, that was really well performed. And I had that response for a lot of the violin work and the clarinet that Julie played, and gosh, it's just everybody did a great job. I don't want to single out people and leave other people out. Of course, that's not fair to them. But it's just you wrote a very technically challenging piece with a lot of moving parts, and I think we got them all moving in the right direction. So that was good.
Yes, and because to be fair, when I was writing that piece, I had no idea that it would win. I was just putting down some ideas, making them coherent. So when I heard that I won, the two thoughts that were going through my mind were, I did not expect this at all. And, I am wondering if they're going to be able to play the piece, because it is very technically demanding in parts. But to your point, they pulled it off incredibly well. And the fact that they were doing it in a remote setting makes it even more impressive. I mean, it is genuinely, that orchestra is it's such an amazing concept, and a lot can go wrong. And yet they played my piece incredibly well. So I have newfound faith in remote orchestras.
Yeah, it just takes the patience to put them all together once you have their great recordings. And I think, one of the things that we have to appreciate a lot of times when people go to other orchestras, as we did with Jordan Janosko's runner-up work, which is 3 sketches of Unblemished Earth, her Symphony No. 1. We recorded that with Budapest Scoring, as we did with my Symphonina No. 5. When Budapest Scoring does their recording, they're sight reading everything. And so, there's a very specific set of skills that you need to be a successful sight reader. And definitely not everybody who's a great performer has them. A lot of people need to practice to nail it, and then they have it nailed. And in your case, I think we had a collective thought that it's not like it wasn't beyond Budapest Scoring to do it. They can pretty much play anything, but the question is, would they get all the nuances of it within the time that we had for our funding to get everything done? So sometimes it's just better to go with this other route where we let everybody play and record, and they can go up to take 57 or 570 if that's what it takes before they hand it back to me. But yes, I definitely appreciated those few times where buried in some large milieu of stuff, you would say there's a wrong note in there. And I'm like, I don't know. But it sounds like jazz to me, Alex. But you would find it. We would go through that's the one. And then we'd get it straightened out. So what are you working on now?
Well, I'm actually currently writing my second Symphonina that I'll be submitting for the competition.
Okay, so everybody's forewarned.
Yes, but to be continued. So that's been my big symphonic work, but because part of my big mission as a composer has been to bring new music to amateur ensembles, because generally, if you're a church or a high school, you're playing a piece, it may be more contemporary, but it's a pretty standard orchestral or band work, and I'm trying to change that narrative to where I go to a specific high school or church and say, I'm going to write a piece for you that'll be completely dedicated to you, and you can perform it whenever you want, and it'll have your name attached to it. And it's been a shockingly successful endeavor because...
Great, that's wonderful.
Yeah, because there's really no competition in the market, to start using business terminology. But because there's no competition, I'm able to enter that market, have my value proposition, and just say things like, I'm a young self-taught composer who wants to write a piece for you. And sometimes, especially for the churches, I'm like, and I'll do it for free. So you won't have to pay a dime. You'll have pieces written for you that you can do at any time. And you can use my name and image for however you want. It's been very successful. And so a lot of what I'll be doing the end of this year, and especially in 25, is really ramping that up and trying to establish myself as a composer that is doing this when a lot of other people are focusing on the professional orchestras. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I just want to give back to those ensembles that really, in retrospect, you wonder about when you played in these ensembles, how much patience these conductors must have had to work with musicians that are not professionals. Some of them just want to do it for fun, and it takes a lot of patience. And so I really want to give them music that they can be really excited about playing because it's a new work.
When you're doing this as a business proposition, is this something that you see as something that's a career move for you, or is it something that you endeavor to do sort of on the side as a side gig, shall we say, or how does that fit into your life's plans?
Yeah. So I'm currently a business major in school, and I do envision going into business after graduation. Part of my issue is I did not expect to get as good as composition as I did this quickly. So for me, I'm sort of having to reevaluate sort of my 5-year plans and stuff like that, because I really started truly composing with structure at 17. I'm 22 now. So there's been a 5-year period in there. And in that 5 years, I've been put on 2 albums. I've won.
You have a gift, Alex. I can't put it any other way. Obviously, you really do. You have a gift for it. So
I appreciate that. And so to see that speed that I've done all of that in the span of 5 years, most of which was just trying to learn composition, I understand that for me, it's probably going to be an exponential type of thing. So I'm not totally sure at the moment where my music will take me, if it will become a career. If it happens to be that I am like a composer in residence somewhere, I will, of course, take that opportunity because I think that music, no offense to business, but I find music to be a much more fulfilling craft personally.
Yeah.
So that is up to the forces that be, essentially.
And we had a talk with Christopher Siu last week, and we were talking a little bit about some of the similar issues here about managing your music as a business and getting into things like you have an innovative way there. And one of the questions that always comes up for musicians, particularly gig musicians, is how do you set your rate? Because someone else is typically trying to make it lower than you want it to be. Especially these days, I would say when I played piano at the Catamaran Hotel here in San Diego from 1994 to 2010, so 16 years. That actually was a pretty good paying gig for 16 years. But from what I understand these days, I don't have a regular gig. I just spot gig these days. But, it's not like they're paying more now and it's 2024. Last time, that was 2010 when I stopped playing regularly. So the environment for individual performances seems to be not particularly friendly, if I can put it that way. Where is it on your viewpoint of like feeling good about quote unquote giving it away versus not feeling good about giving it away, and maybe pressure that you get from other musicians to not give it away and things like that? It's complicated and it has its controversies, but I'd appreciate hearing your positions on that.
Sure. And I mean, like, I can really only speak to like myself as a 22-year-old who doesn't have to rely on an income in music. So for me, it's very much like a grab and go type of thing where I can pick up gigs as I want and I don't have to sustain or like be sustained on that income because, like, as I said, my career will most likely be in business. So for me, music will be more of a passion project. It'll be a huge passion project, but it would be a secondary source of income rather than the first. But I will say now, part of my big thing obviously has been trying to find a niche in the market, especially if it's a niche that like no one else is really in, so you can really set your own rate. I mean, that's been the thing with these high school ensembles is I have a lot of flexibility to say, here's my rate, I can work with you on it, but I do want to be paid something for my work. And it tends to work. There's been large success in that. So trying to find those areas where you can set your own rate and have that flexibility, they are certainly out there. It does take some time. And I think you have to explore routes that maybe are kind of crazy in the moment. But because I feel like for the Symphonina Foundation, I mean, I'm sure when you started that, it was not like you had the complete vision and now it's exactly how you thought it was going to be. It changes. And so I think having the mindset of adapting to that change, because like you look at the Symphonina Foundation now and how much it's exploded and how popular it's become. So I would suggest having the same mindset as a composer, knowing that how you start is not how you're going to end, but you figure out a lot along the way and just figuring out that, supply and demand, what people are willing to pay for that kind of stuff. So it is like a business.
Have you done anything on film scoring or TV scoring, video game scoring?
I have written the soundtrack for a video game. It was through the University of Missouri Columbia has their own video game creation like sector in their school. And they approached me this past summer, and they said, we've heard your name through the grapevine. We'd like you to write the soundtrack to our video game. And so that was my summer project. It is something I have always wanted to do. I have 3 goals that I want to accomplish by the time I'm 25. It's to have a piece performed by an orchestra, compose the music to a video game, and then compose the music to like a movie. And so I've gotten the first 2 down. So my next goal is film scoring.
Do you have a plan for that? Obviously, it's a very competitive segment of music composition. What's your idea? Or you don't have to share it if it's secret. Of course, you can
No,
keep your niche to yourself.
I have no secrets. It goes back to my niche thinking, because I know a lot of people, when they want to do film scoring, they want to do big films. And I, of course, want to do that as well. But I also recognize the fact that the road to that point is very rarely someone at the top just sends an email to you and is like, we've heard your name, like, we want you to write for it. You have to prove yourself as a composer who's willing to do that. So my big thing would be taking small steps, maybe like reaching out to indie films, for example, and saying, I can write you a movie soundtrack for this price or whatever. Because it's actually accomplishing two things. One, I'm establishing myself as someone who can do it. But two, I have a product that fits the film scoring market. So if I do want to approach like someone who wants the music to a film, I can be like, well, I've done this project, this project, this project. So I'm trying to think as long-term as I possibly can, instead of just being like, here's my goal, and then here's what I'm going to do it. It's more like, here's the goal. Here's how I'm establishing and framing myself as a composer that will be able to do it.
I think it's great to have a conversation with a young person who has patience and has a long-term view. Not to say that young people don't in general. I mean, I think a lot of young people, as people who know me know, I have two 19-year-old twins, so I know about young people, but they're both pretty patient too. I think there was a time when young people that I knew were not so patient and wanted to have it all right away, kind of thing, even though that wasn't very realistic. But it's all very nice, but and maybe it's good to have that as an aspiration anyway. Just go for the top. Maybe that's the way to get to the top eventually, is to go for the top from the beginning. But I do appreciate your patient perspective of building a wall one brick at a time, so to speak, and making sure that the bricks count along the way. It's good. All right. Well, Alex, if people want to get in touch with you to get that next film score, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Sure. So I have a website. It's alexanderunseth.com. AlexanderUnseth.com. You can send me an email through, I have a form at the bottom of the homepage, so you can send me like an email if you want a commission or questions, anything like that. That website also has a couple of my performed works on it, as well as a bio, so you can understand more about me as a composer. If you want to follow me on social media, my Instagram is aunseth02. Those are the two main ways, because again, you can send me an email from my website, and hopefully that will answer any questions you have.
Well, Alex, thank you so much. We're going to listen to some more of your great music on the way out here. And for everybody else, we will see you on the next podcast. Alex, thank you again. It's been great. And I look forward to working with you either on another prize winner or anything else that we can do together in the future.
Thank you so much, David. You are the greatest.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Have a great day, Alex.
Thank you.